Welcome to Inside Academia, the weekly program where we take a look behind the ivory curtain, seeking a frank discussion of American education. I'm your host, Andy Nash. My guest today is Dr. George Nash. He's a senior fellow at the Russell Kirk Center, an affiliate scholar at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and he serves on the editorial advisory board of Modern Age. He's also authored several books, including The Conservative Intellectual Movement in America Since 1945, Reappraising the Right, The Past and Future of American Conservatism, a 3-volume biography on the life of Herbert Hoover, and Books and the Founding Fathers. He's appeared in documentaries and has published articles and reviews, appearing in National Review, The Wall Street Journal, Policy Review, Modern Age, and the New York Times Book Review, among others. He's also the 2008 recipient of the Richard M. Weaver Award for Scholarly Letters. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute American Studies Center has a summer institute for advanced graduate students and untenured faculty. This summer's conference took place in Princeton University, with the focus being on the Constitution and American identity. There, Dr. George Nash delivered a talk entitled Educating for Liberty, the Reverend John Witherspoon and his Impact on the Founding Generation. Dr. George Nash, welcome to Inside Academia.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I want to talk to you a little bit about what you discussed at the ISI Princeton Conference. You talked about John Witherspoon, and I would like today to focus with you a little bit on what education was like in early revolutionary and colonial America. John Witherspoon, being a Scottish Presbyterian, was a prominent evangelical minister in Scotland before becoming the 6th president of Princeton University in 1768. According to Wikipedia, he transformed a college designed predominantly to train clergymen into a school that would equip the leaders of a revolutionary generation. He made fundamental changes to the moral philosophy curriculum. I would like to begin today, Dr. Nash, by talking a little bit about what exactly that meant. What happened with how universities in America transformed moral philosophy, and what role did that play for the revolutionary time period and going beyond?
Yes, John Witherspoon became president of Princeton in 1768, as you mentioned, and remained president until 1794. So he educated a generation of young Americans who went into leadership roles in the new society. There were only 9 colleges in the American colonies on the eve of the American Revolution, and Princeton, as of 1775, had graduated about 20% of the college graduates in the preceding few years. So Princeton was very central, and that's where he was. These colleges had a very classically oriented curriculum. Even to get admission to the colleges, boys, and they were boys in those days, generally around the age of 13, who applied for admission, had to demonstrate proficiency in translating Latin into English, Greek into Latin, Greek into English. Those were their entrance requirements. So the college curriculum was heavily oriented toward what we would call the classics, ancient literature and languages. But it also broadened out somewhat over the course of the 4 years of college education in those days to what was called natural philosophy. We would say various divisions of science, for example, toward rhetoric, and toward what was called moral philosophy, a key course, particularly for seniors. This was it's been called a capstone course, and these courses were generally taught by Witherspoon himself at Princeton and by other college presidents. That was their role. It was like the finishing off course for the 4-year matriculants. What Witherspoon did was not to reject the curriculum. He himself was an accomplished Latin scholar. He corresponded with one of his sons in Latin, and he admired the ancients in many ways. But he was a Scottish Presbyterian minister, and many of his students went on into the Protestant ministry, generally Presbyterian, coming out of Princeton. But what he did was to adapt the curriculum to the times in the sense that he wanted to teach moral philosophy, not simply divinity as it was called, or theology. Moral philosophy was a broad term, meaning encompassing for us political philosophy, jurisprudence, and ethics. So it was really a sort of a study of human relations in the deep philosophical sense. What were the groundings of liberty and virtue, and so forth. Basic philosophical issues about the good life. And what he did in his curriculum at Princeton was to introduce John Locke, Montesquieu, Francis Hutcheson, the father of the Scottish Enlightenment, their writings, as part of his curriculum teachings. Now, he didn't have a textbook. He made out lecture notes, which every student literally had to copy out by hand. It was only after his death that his lecture notes on moral philosophy were published, and so we have some sense of the teaching that he was bringing to that. But he brought a study of politics into the curriculum that included Whig political theory, Republican theory from Britain, and so on. And this was amazingly relevant right at that moment in the late 1760s and 1770s as the turmoil between the colonies and the mother country intensified and led ultimately to the American Revolution. So Princeton, which had existed for about 20 years before his coming, had been thought of as primarily a school for the training of ministers. And then it became known as the School for Statesmen. Well, the British on their side, the Tories and Loyalists, call it a school for sedition. So Witherspoon was bringing teachings about ancient and modern political philosophy and applying that, or allowing students perhaps, to put it better, to apply that to the disputes that were occurring all around them in the society. And as they graduated, James Madison, class of 1771, being a prize example, he was one of the favorite pupils of John Witherspoon. People like Madison went out into the world. Many of them became teachers, lawyers, and so forth, and took positions of prominence not only in civic society, but ultimately in the whole Revolutionary War and its aftermath.
Educating for liberty meant having a curriculum that included morals and virtues, I guess, through a philosophical or academic track. Would that be a fair way of assessing that? So in other words, it wasn't just in terms of what people did outside of the classroom. Very much the curriculum itself had to do with moral philosophy and the study of virtue going back to the ancient Greco-Roman stories and histories.
Yes, and Professor, or I should say Dr. Witherspoon, taught rhetoric, he taught history, he taught divinity. It was a very small faculty, by the way. There were only about 2 professors and the president and a couple of tutors, and the college student body was under 100 people. So you have to keep in mind this is a very small college, as were all of the others, really. Only a few hundred people were attending college at any one time in the colonies in that period. So it's totally different from the behemoth universities that we have today.
Right.
So this was a training for people who went on to positions of prominence and leadership, the elite, if you will.
Okay.
And through the teaching of history, they were learning moral lessons. Part of their attitude toward history was that if you studied the ancient Rome and Greece and so on, you could learn principles of human conduct, universals that were constant in human nature. And you could, in a sense, become a scientist of human nature by studying the past in a systematic way. So history wasn't just facts and figures and names and dates. It was lessons of principle, lessons of prudence, lessons of proper conduct in the public square. All of that is quite apart from the moral philosophy synthesizing course. We're teaching people for roles of active and productive consequence in the society once they left college.
As you said, it was originally a school for clergymen. It had become a school for statesmen, as many prominent people went through the ranks of Princeton. And they themselves learned all the virtues and the necessities for governing honestly. And typically we don't find that among politicians anymore these days. But all of this in a pre-industrial age shows or suggests that higher education, in the classical sense, offered very little of anything of any kind of utilitarian value. So prior to the onset of the land-grant colleges in the mid-19th century, higher education was very much just that. It was higher in that you learned all of these aspects of philosophy and history insofar as it was a plan for better human conduct and greater human nature. But in contrasting that with today's universities, we've fallen far away from that as being a mission or a role of universities. Maybe some private colleges still may hold on to those missions or those ideals, but for the most part, universities today talk about character development, but they don't very much talk about moral philosophy, if you will. So how important would it be today to try to reinvigorate or try to reestablish a classical idea as per the colonial model of education in today's world, or would it even be remotely even possible?
It is being attempted here and there in the American colleges through the homeschooling movement, the Christian classical school movement, the revival of studies of the classics, great books-oriented colleges. These are obviously, in terms of total enrollment, affecting a small minority of the college student population at this time. But they do hark back in interesting ways to what was really the mainstream approach to education in the era of Witherspoon and well into the 19th century. Again, I underscore that this was a small group of people being educated in those days, and generally boys went to school around the age of 8. They had to pass entrance exams, as I described. Then they were graduating before they were 21 years old, although as time went by they tended to be a little older. But in some ways they were a prep school age in our, if we were to compare them to today, but they were receiving this very intense and disciplined study. No extracurricular activities at Princeton, really, except for a couple of, you might say, debating clubs, the Whig and Cliosophic societies at Princeton. There was no organized sports at that time, no electives, essentially no electives. It was a required 4-year curriculum. And if I may just give you one other example of how different this is from the kind of cafeteria-style education that we see around us today. At Princeton, in Witherspoon's time, the students lived in one room, in one building, 3 to a room. Nassau Hall, which still exists on the campus, a large stone building, that was the campus in those days. One building, dormitory, classroom, chapel, cafeteria, or dining commons, that was all under one roof. And those students were awakened at 5 in the morning by a bell. They were given till 5:30 a.m. to dress. They then went off to compulsory morning prayers. They then studied for a while before breakfast at 8 o'clock. From 9 till 1, they were in class. From 1 till 3, they had some time off. From 3 to 5, they studied. At 5 o'clock, the bell rang again for evening prayers. And then they had, after evening prayers, they had either before or after supper, I'm not sure which, they had a period in which they gave orations, 2 or 3 a night, as part of this great emphasis on rhetoric and public speaking, a kind of training or educating for liberty and leadership. And then at 9 o'clock, they all had to be back in their rooms. They could study by candlelight if they wanted to once they were in their rooms, but it was very regimented by our standards, very rigorous, and highly disciplined, and so far as I can judge, generally accepted. There was a certain amount of hijinks and boys going down to the tavern on their time off, things like that in the village of Princeton. But I give you a typical day in the life of a Princeton student in the 1770s, 1780s, does not look, I think, like a typical day in the life of almost any American college student today.
No, it certainly does not, and I think your description answers the question, at least in my mind, as to whether or not colonial education would ever be able to reincarnate itself in the modern age. I don't think it can. But nonetheless, everything you described, though, I think is very instructive in explaining how it was able to produce, if that's even a good word to use, the type of virtuous person that you alluded to earlier that rose to the level of statesmanship. I think we've fallen far away from that kind of an education in this day and age. But I always say it's worth re-exploring and investigating what that was and what that was like. Well, yes, go ahead.
I left out one important part of the student's character and moral and educational formation, and that was church attendance. At Princeton, they had to go to church twice on Sunday and hear Dr. Witherspoon speak in his thick Scottish brogue. That was at 11 a.m. at the Presbyterian Church and 3 o'clock back in Nassau Hall. There was no sign of rebellion against this, and there were prayer meetings and other forms of religious inspiration and practice, some of them voluntary. So they were not only in an intense educational atmosphere, but they were in an intense moral and spiritual atmosphere, as one would expect of people, many of whom did go into the ministry.
With the diversified world we live in today, with different religions and people with all kinds of different backgrounds and ways of doing things and cultural approaches to different things, could such a environment that existed in Princeton ever take place, or do you necessarily need to have that cultural and religious homogeneity that those people of that time and place had in order for something like that to even work?
Two answers to that. I think that this kind of institution can be replicated in a limited way and is being, as we discussed a moment ago, through the homeschooling movement and then the creation of academies with a strong, and colleges with a strong faith basis. And those colleges and universities in this country are, as I understand it, growing in enrollment. They represent a relatively small percentage of the total, but they are viable, at least for some. The second answer to your question would be that I don't think you have to have total form of the Princetonian 18th century or 18th century classical kind to implicate a liberal arts education. But one thing that I would recommend, and what Princeton did in its own way, and the other colleges at the time, was to have required readings in what we would call the great books, the classics. I had that at Amherst College when I went to college in the 1960s. In a humanities class, there are occasionally great books courses that one sees and hears about in colleges, but they are generally few and far between, elective, and only affecting, sadly, a small number of the students. I think more could be done with that, and without getting into theological questions necessarily for state-supported schools and issues like that, one could have a much more exposure of today's students to the world of history and learning that the Princeton students had 2 centuries ago.
Well, Dr. George Nash, I thank you very kindly for joining us today. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to have had this conversation with you.
Excellent. I'm Andy Nash. This has been InsideAcademia.tv. Please join us again next week, as every week, as we take you for a look behind the Ivory Curtain.